Okay, so this is a demo on the App Initializer provider in Angular 6. And basically, what I wanted to do is I wanted to figure out the best way to possibly look at a URL and brand an application based on, let's say, a business unit. So my goal was to say, well, suppose I had a URL and I had a company name here, which was GE or IBM. And based on that URL, I hit on the URL, and now I have an Angular application, and I need to theme the app appropriately for that URL or business name, business unit, or business name, or whatever I call it. And at the same time, I want to get my application settings so I have certain functionality for that particular business name. So putting that aside, I didn't really, I simulated the problem in my own little way on my local host. And what I did was I created an index.html, which is the white background, and I have a root component, which is the blue background, and I have these app initializers, which get fired up and call and initialize the app and call a web service to go get app settings based on the URL. So what I do is I look at the URL, I actually log it. So basically I get the current URL, and based on that I map that URL to let's suppose a business name or business category, and based on that I make a web service call and I get something off of the Amazon cloud, let's say in a certain bucket. So let's just simulate this for a moment. I hit on the URL has a business name on it. I go and I get something out of that particular bucket on Amazon cloud, and in that bucket I have this settings file, which is a JSON file, and I go get it and I display it. So for example, if it was Angular Orange, I'd be getting these particular values. So the real code that I'm looking at here is an AppLoadModule, which does the initialization for an Angular 6 application. And so in the process of doing that, I decided to look at the URL and try to map that to the business settings, and that's another perspective of what I'm trying to do here. But really the demo is looking at app initialization. And so once I do that initialize, what I'm doing is going to get the app settings before my root component actually instantiates and gets created. So let's take a look at the code now. Just so you know, it looks a little bit complex, but it really isn't. And I did take this code off the web, and I modified it. So I must give credit to that particular developer. So let me go and first find that particular developer and show you. So I did. If you do a search on AppLoadService. And I think this might be it. This is the website that I went to actually get the code. So I didn't just build this, but what I notice here is he did create an AppLoadModule, and I kind of like that. And I went in and I changed some things, and this is with Angular 4, and of course I'm running Angular 6. So I just basically downloaded his code, modified some things, and then I guess the interesting thing was what I was trying to determine is really how to use it within my Angular application, which was another perspective. Okay, so I'll show you what I did. Okay, so this is what I did. I actually created an app initialize project using Angular CLI from WebStorm. I did a file, and I created using Angular CLI. I don't have to go through that and show that to you. And what he did for me was I downloaded his code and I load it into my modules directory here. And what I did was I modified some things. Of course, I was trying to determine whether I really wanted to use the HTTP client module. So what I did was I just took my settings file and put it on Amazon cloud, and I decided to use that URL to go get my JSON file with my settings in it. So So let's just first go through the motions of looking at the application. So this was the code he gave me, which was the app module and the service. And so my job was to try to figure out how to use it and whether it made sense for me in an Angular application context. So here's my Angular application that got automatically built by default. And what I did was I loaded in the app module that was essentially his code before I modified it, and I basically imported it into my custom app module for my application. And then what I also did was I exported it. So there's some things coming in the app module, like in particular there's this AppLoadService, and I wanted it accessible for my app. So I had to figure out, is this the appropriate way to do this? So, and then I did that, and for my app module, I have everything that's in this AppLoadModule, which is exported, including that AppLoadService. So, so in some sense, my component, and we'll come back to this, my root component that I'm bootstrapping here, if you look at it, I imported the AppLoadService and I injected it into the constructor, and I created some functions that were not in his particular module to get the preloaded settings and get my current URL and stuff like that, and I put them in my component. So that, from an abstract point of view, that's what I did. So let's take a look at the code in real detail. Now, I just want to point out before I leave this particular file is that this AppLoadService is a thing in my AppLoadModule which gets called and initializes before this root component even comes into play in the Angular application. Before the Angular application starts running, my Angular module starts running. Before this root component gets instantiated, this app service was already called by the AppLoadModule in the initialization phase, because I defined these app initializer providers which fired up before my Angular app. So that is one thing I want to point out, that when I inject this in here, it's a singleton that's already been created. So I'm not creating it again. I'm just calling the existing values from the service. Okay, so let's just back up here and go back to the module that was given to me, as well as the service. Okay. So I was told that I could have a module which initializes, and the way I do that, the way it's done is within the module, the AppLoadModule, I have to define these providers which have this app initializer key. Okay, and so what I do is I import the app initializer from Angular Core. And I define this app initializer here that gets invoked, and it uses this factory, and one of them is called Initialize App, and the other one's called Get Settings. So if you look at the module here, basically what it does is it uses common module, it uses HTTP client module, and it defines providers, which is our AppLoadService, and this app initializer and this app initializer are things that get fired up initially before my Angular application starts running, before my root component gets created. And we'll see that in a log file. And these are both done in parallel, asynchronously. Okay, and the truth of the matter is, these service calls all return promises. So basically, it's an asynchronous call that's waiting for responses, and both of them get invoked in parallel. And until both of them are completed, the application, the Angular application, doesn't start running. That is, the root component isn't going to get created until these two functions get called. Okay, so this app load module is the, I wanted to call it the startup module or app initialization module or something, but I just left it as the app load module, just because I'm having trouble understanding really what it is. And it is before, when the app gets loaded, it does fire up these two initializer functions before the app does start to load. And so you'll see that in the log file. Or maybe I phrased that wrong. They fire up to initialize the loading process. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So I have these providers here. This app initializer calls Initialize App. This Initialize App uses this injected AppLoadService, and it calls Initialize App. The AppLoadService is over here. We haven't looked at that yet. The get settings also, you inject the AppLoadService into that, and basically you call the get settings on that. Okay, so if you look at the so this is just a module which fires up two initializers which depend on AppLoadService, and they both get done in parallel before my root component gets instantiated. Okay, so let's look at the AppLoadService, and this is a little bit complicated, but it's because I made it a little bit complicated. So let me try to explain this. First of all, I have this app settings class that I use, and basically it's here. It just has I export it. It's called let. It does a let, and it has an app settings, and it has this structure, and I'm defining this variable inside my service. So when I import this, I have this variable called app settings, which has these attributes in it. And when I call my functions, I actually set the attributes. So this has scope. This thing has scope inside my function, inside my AppLoadService. Okay, and so in my AppLoadService, I have a current URL. My constructor, I use the HTTP client. I get my current window location, and I'm just logging constructor begin, constructor exit. My Initialize App, which was one of my asynchronous functions, returns a promise of type any, and what it does is it defines this new promise with a resolve and reject, and basically what I do is I log some stuff here. I'm in the Initializer, Initialize App. I'm not really doing anything in that function. I'm logging the current URL. I'm mapping the user URL to the settings URL. It's fictitious. There's nothing happening in that function. I'm just making believe I'm taking the URL and basically mapping it to a business unit. But I'm really not, because my URL is just going to a JSON file, which I can denote by, I can categorize it by business name with the Amazon bucket names, but I'm not doing that, and I might do that eventually. But that would be my solution, depending on how many business names I have. And basically, I also do a SetTimeout, and I say I'm inside the SetTimeout, ready to resolve, and then I just resolve the promise. So in this Initialize App, it's really not doing much initialization. It's just saying, here's a log. I'm logging something. I'm making believe I'm mapping a URL to a settings URL, whatever. And then I'm waiting 3 seconds, and I'm doing a resolve just to show you that this asynchronous stuff is still happening and must happen before my root component gets instantiated. My get settings does a little bit more. It does an HTTP client. It goes out to AngularOrange.io, gets a settings object, and basically I get the settings values and I put them all into my app settings string, and I return the settings, and I return the promise. And then when I want those app settings, I do a get preloaded settings, because those settings are now in an instance variable in my service. And I could also get the current URL from my instance of my AppLoadService. And my map user URL to settings URL does nothing, but if I were to do something, I would grab the end of the URL, like the IBM phrase or the GE Capital phrase or whatever business my URL is pointing to, and I would take that and I would call. I would do something like this and make believe I have a bucket name there with IBM or something, and I would go get the settings. So there's a way to do it. Okay. So now let's go and just take a look to see what happens here. So basically, if we look at the log file, what we'd see. Okay, let's take a look to see what the log file does. Okay, so might have done a little too much logging here. Okay, so okay, so let's take a look at this here. I think I might have done just a little too much logging here for my own good, because there's a lot of asynchronous stuff going on. So let me go and try to simplify this a little bit. So let's go back here and let's take a quick look at this. So this AppLoad service comes in, and this module gets loaded, and I got these two initializer providers, and one does Initialize App and one does a get settings, and there's an AppLoad service that gets injected. So AppLoad service has to get instantiated, and the Initialize App has to happen. The get settings has to happen. So let's take a look to see what's going on there. Okay. So the app service constructor happened. I logged the URL. I exited the constructor, and now I'm in the Initialize App. Okay. I'm inside the promise anonymous function. I call map user URL to settings URL. I enter the get settings. I call the web service API to get the settings, and then here's the settings that are returned, and you'll see each setting. And here is the app settings object. Okay, so this one was returned from the web service API, and then I took those values and put it in the app settings object. And then here, notice this, Initialize App inside SetTimeout that is inside the promise, ready to resolve. Now this asynchronous value comes 3 seconds later that the SetTimeout happened, and it might seem a little bit confusing, but the point is that it happens before my app starts running. Okay, I enter the get preload settings. I exit the preload settings. I'm returning the app settings, and I exit this stuff, and now my Angular is running in development mode. And I'm ready to go. Now the thing you have to realize here is there wasn't another AppLoadService.constructor happened. So let's go take a look at the code again. Inside this inside my root component, I did a get preload settings. I did a get URL type. When this thing started getting constructed, this service already existed, and those two initialization calls on that service already existed. Let's try to convince ourselves that's the case. Let me just do this. And put it here. And this is going to be my app component. And I just need an exit here. Okay, so the big challenge for me was, after I looked at that solution on the web of the initializations happening before my root component comes into play, is how do I get that information in my application UI component tree? Since I have it in a separate module, and the separate module does these app initializers to initialize state to get settings or whatever, that stuff winds up in here inside this settings object. So what I had to do is I had to create something to return me those values, because I don't have them inside my UI component tree. So then in my own app module, in my own root component, I have to go and inject this service. It's a singleton, it already exists. So I injected it and I go get those values. And so what we'll see here is that before my root component is created, I already have my app settings. The Initialize app already happened. It also was ready to resolve. It already resolved. The two initializers with the promises have to resolve. They both have to resolve before my root component constructor happens, and notice it does. And all I do is I go get those values inside that service that I need, those app settings. So that's really all I wanted to show you as I display it in my template. I could go back and show you the code for the template, because I have my settings here, my current URL here, and all I did was put it in my template. And I put some H1 tags, some H2 tags, some H3 tags for the headers, and I just put, I displayed my JSON data by just piping my settings through a JSON pipe. I showed my current URL because I'm exposing that through my component as well. And then I have my settings object, and I just show the attributes of my settings object. And keep in mind that I guess what I didn't show you was my settings JSON data. And so I'll just show you that on my desktop. It's called settings, okay? And this was my settings file. It was my JSON data, and all I did was put it out. All I did, and I'm not too crazy about this format either, and that's really all I wanted to show you for this demo.